Have you ever lain awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation that already ended, rehearsing one that has not happened yet, and worrying about a problem that may never even occur? Your body is still. Your room is silent. And yet your mind is running, sprinting in circles, as if sitting still for even a moment might allow something terrible to catch up with you. You were not broken in that moment. You were simply untrained in a skill nobody ever taught you directly, the skill of choosing which thoughts get to stay and which ones get to pass quietly through without being followed. Most people believe a busy mind is simply the price of being responsible, of caring enough to think ahead, of taking life seriously. So the mind keeps racing, and racing gets mistaken for thinking, when in reality, racing and thinking are almost opposites. A racing mind rarely reaches a conclusion. It simply loops again and again, mistaking motion for progress. Here is the idea this entire audiobook is built around. Anxiety is not a signal that something is wrong with you. It is a signal that your attention has been hijacked by a thought that feels urgent, without actually being useful. Total clarity does not come from thinking harder or worrying more thoroughly. It comes from learning to notice the difference between a thought that deserves attention and a thought that is simply noise wearing the costume of importance. Over the course of this audiobook, you will learn why worry so often disguises itself as preparation, why the present moment is the only place anxiety genuinely cannot follow you, why a cluttered mind is rarely a product of having too many real problems, and far more often a product of having too many unfinished, unexamined thoughts running in the background at once, and why the calmest, clearest thinkers are not people who feel less. They are people who have learned to listen to fewer of their own thoughts and to trust the ones that remain. You do not need to stop thinking. You do not need to force your mind into an artificial, permanent silence. You simply need to learn which thoughts to follow and which to let pass. Think of every night spent replaying a conversation that had already ended hours earlier, every morning that began already exhausted from a battle that took place entirely inside your own head, while your body lay perfectly still. None of that proved your mind was broken, or that you were simply someone destined to think too much. It proved only that no one had ever shown you the difference between a thought worth following and a thought worth releasing. This audiobook exists to show you exactly that, and it begins now. Introduction. The mind that never learned to rest. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort, the tiredness of a mind that has spent an entire day or an entire year running through scenarios that never happened, replaying moments that cannot be changed, and rehearsing conversations that may never actually take place. This exhaustion is invisible to everyone else, and it is often mistaken, even by the person experiencing it, for simple stress, simple busyness, simply the cost of caring. The truth underneath this exhaustion is both simpler and more hopeful than it first appears. The mind was never taught the difference between a thought worth following and a thought worth releasing. Every thought, urgent or trivial, real or imagined, gets treated with the same default seriousness, the same demand for attention, the same insistence on being solved immediately. A mind operating this way cannot rest, not because life is genuinely that overwhelming, but because it has never learned to sort its own contents. The philosopher Aristotle observed that it is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it. Applied here, an untrained mind treats every thought as true simply because it arrived, every worry as necessary simply because it appeared, every worst-case scenario as likely simply because it can be imagined vividly enough. A trained mind, by contrast, can notice a thought fully, consider it honestly, and still set it down without following it into hours of unnecessary spiraling. This audiobook is not about eliminating thought, emotion, or genuine concern from a life. It is about restoring a distinction that anxiety consistently erodes, the distinction between a thought that carries real, actionable information and a thought that is simply loud. Across the chapters ahead, you will learn to recognize the 5 thought patterns that manufacture anxiety without producing any real solution, why worry so often masquerades as responsible preparation while actually preventing it, how the present moment functions as a kind of shelter anxiety cannot fully enter, and how a genuinely quiet mind is built gradually, through daily practice, rather than through a single dramatic insight that instantly resolves everything at once. None of this requires a naturally calm temperament, a particular personality type, or years of formal training in meditation or psychology, though any of those can certainly help alongside what follows here. It requires attention, redirected gradually away from every thought that arrives with urgency, and toward a simpler, more honest question: does this specific thought deserve to be followed right now, or is it simply passing through, another piece of mental weather that will move on entirely on its own if it is not chased? None of this requires becoming someone who no longer cares, no longer plans, or no longer feels the natural weight of real problems. It requires learning to meet those real problems with a clear, uncluttered mind, rather than with one already exhausted by hundreds of imagined ones that were never actually going to happen in the first place. Chapter 1. Why your mind won't stop racing. A racing mind rarely feels like a choice. It feels like something happening to you, thought after thought arriving uninvited, each one demanding immediate attention before the last one has even been fully processed. Understanding why this happens is the first step toward changing it, because a racing mind is not random. It follows a specific, learnable pattern. The human brain evolved to treat uncertainty as danger. An unresolved question, an unfinished task, an ambiguous social interaction, all register at some deep and largely unconscious level as a kind of threat requiring urgent resolution. This made excellent sense for a species surviving in genuinely dangerous physical environments, where an unresolved question about a nearby predator needed immediate attention to survive. It makes considerably less sense applied to an unanswered email, a mildly awkward comment made 3 days ago, or a hypothetical future event that has not happened and may never happen at all. The racing mind, in other words, is running an ancient alarm system on a modern set of problems it was never actually designed to solve. The alarm fires the same way whether the danger is a genuine physical threat or a vague, unresolved worry about how a colleague interpreted an email. The mind cannot easily distinguish between these two categories on its own, which is precisely why deliberate, learned distinction becomes necessary. There is also a specific reinforcing loop worth naming directly. Worry often produces a small temporary sense of control, the feeling that by thinking about a problem enough, some kind of progress is being made towards solving it. This feeling is frequently false. Most anxious thought loops do not produce new information or genuine solutions. They simply repeat the same handful of concerns in slightly different order, producing the sensation of productive thinking without any of its actual substance. Recognizing this loop for what it is, repetition disguised as problem-solving, is the first meaningful step toward interrupting it. Consider someone lying awake at night, replaying a minor disagreement from earlier in the day. Each replay feels, in the moment, like it might finally produce the perfect response that was missed the first time, or some new insight that will resolve the lingering discomfort. In practice, the 15th replay rarely differs meaningfully from the third one. The same details repeat, the same emotions resurface, and no genuinely new information ever actually arrives. What continues is not problem-solving. It is simply an ancient alarm system, still convinced that continued vigilance will eventually produce safety, running long after any useful signal it might have offered has already been extracted. This same pattern extends into the daytime hours as well, showing up as a persistent, low-grade background hum, even during tasks that have nothing to do with whatever originally triggered it. A single unresolved worry from the morning can quietly color an entire afternoon, reducing focus and enjoyment across activities completely unrelated to the original concern, simply because the ancient alarm system has not yet received a clear signal that the perceived threat has passed or been adequately addressed. Understanding this mechanism does not require becoming an expert in neuroscience or evolutionary psychology. It simply requires recognizing in the moment a thought begins spiraling that the intensity of the alarm bears very little relationship to the actual size of the situation triggering it. A racing mind treats a minor social awkwardness with roughly the same urgency it would apply to genuine physical danger. And recognizing this mismatch clearly, in real time, is often enough to create a small amount of skepticism toward the alarm's message. Exactly the kind of skepticism a quiet mind eventually learns to apply consistently. There is a further, encouraging detail worth adding here, that this alarm system, however persistent, is not permanently fixed in its sensitivity. Just as it can become more reactive through repeated anxious rehearsal, it can also become considerably calmer through repeated evidence that a perceived threat, examined honestly, turned out to be manageable or entirely unfounded. Each time this happens, and it is noticed consciously rather than simply forgotten, the alarm system gathers a small amount of updated information, gradually recalibrating its sensitivity toward a more accurate, less exaggerated assessment of ordinary daily situations. Chapter 2. The 5 Thought Patterns that Manufacture Anxiety. Certain patterns of thinking reliably produce anxiety regardless of the actual size or likelihood of the situation being considered. Recognizing these 5 patterns by name makes them considerably easier to catch in the moment they begin, rather than only noticing them once they have already produced hours of unnecessary distress. The first pattern is catastrophizing, assuming the worst possible outcome is not just possible but likely. A minor physical symptom becomes a serious illness. A single critical comment becomes evidence of an entire relationship failing. This pattern feels protective, as if preparing for the worst somehow prevents it, when in reality it simply produces the emotional experience of a disaster that in the vast majority of cases was never actually going to happen. The second pattern is mind reading, assuming confident knowledge of what someone else is thinking, almost always assuming the worst version of their thoughts. A friend's delayed reply becomes assumed anger. A boss's neutral expression becomes assumed disappointment. This pattern manufactures conflict and distress based entirely on invented information, since the actual content of another person's thoughts remains, in most cases, genuinely unknown. The third pattern is fortune-telling, predicting a specific negative future outcome with false certainty. This will never work. They will definitely say no. I will definitely fail. These predictions feel like realistic assessment and function instead as self-fulfilling prophecies, often producing exactly the anxious, defeated energy that makes the predicted failure considerably more likely to occur. The fourth pattern is all or nothing thinking, viewing any outcome short of complete success as complete failure. A presentation with one imperfect moment becomes, in this pattern, an entire disaster, rather than what it usually actually was, a mostly successful presentation containing one minor imperfection nobody else may have even noticed. The fifth pattern is should statements, a rigid, exhausting internal rulebook about how things must be, how people should behave, how a day should unfold. Every deviation from this rulebook produces frustration or anxiety, not because the deviation is genuinely harmful, but because it violates an arbitrary standard that was rarely examined critically before being adopted as an absolute rule. Recognizing these 5 patterns by name transforms them from invisible automatic reactions into something that can actually be noticed, questioned, and set down. The goal is not to never think these thoughts again, which is not realistic. It is to recognize them quickly enough that they no longer get treated as reliable, trustworthy information about reality. These 5 patterns rarely operate in isolation. Catastrophizing feeds mind reading, which feeds fortune-telling, which feeds all or nothing thinking. Each pattern lending false credibility to the next until an entire anxious narrative feels thoroughly, convincingly true, despite being built almost entirely from assumption rather than evidence. Naming a single pattern accurately as it begins is often enough to interrupt the entire chain before it fully develops into the exhausting, self-reinforcing spiral these patterns tend to produce when left unexamined. It helps to remember that experiencing one of these 5 patterns occasionally does not indicate a serious problem requiring alarm. Nearly everyone falls into all 5 at various points, particularly during periods of genuine stress or exhaustion. The goal is not permanent immunity, which realistically does not exist for anyone. The goal is simply catching the pattern slightly sooner each time it appears, so that its eventual grip on attention and mood shrinks a little more with each repetition of the practice. There is a useful daily habit worth building around these 5 patterns, briefly reviewing, at the end of an anxious day, which specific patterns showed up and in what situations they tended to appear. This kind of review, done consistently over weeks, often reveals a personal signature, particular situations, times of day, or topics that reliably trigger a specific pattern more than others. Recognizing this signature allows for considerably faster identification the next time a familiar situation begins producing the same familiar thought pattern. There is a final, reassuring observation worth adding here, that identifying a personal pattern by name, catastrophizing, mind-reading, fortune-telling, all-or-nothing thinking should statements does not require perfect accuracy in labeling to be useful. Even an approximate identification, this feels like catastrophizing, or something close to it, tends to create enough distance from the thought to slow its momentum. Considerably more distance than treating the thought as an unexamined, undifferentiated wave of pure anxious feeling ever could. Before we move into the next chapter, if recognizing these patterns is already resonating with you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because every audiobook in this series builds toward the same underlying skill, a mind that thinks clearly rather than one that simply thinks constantly. Now let's continue, because what comes next explains one of the most important distinctions this entire audiobook has to offer. Chapter 3. The difference between a thought and a fact. One of the most liberating distinctions available to an anxious mind is also one of the simplest to state and one of the hardest to genuinely internalize. A thought is not automatically a fact. It arrives with the same internal texture as a fact, immediate, convincing, seemingly self-evident, and yet it is frequently nothing more than an interpretation, a guess, or an old, worn pattern repeating itself without any fresh evidence attached to it at all. Consider the thought, "I'm going to fail at this." This thought can arrive with tremendous conviction, complete with a vivid mental image of the failure and a genuine physical sensation of dread. None of that intensity makes the thought true. It simply makes the thought feel true, which is a considerably different thing, though the two are extremely easy to confuse in the moment they actually occur. A useful practice for restoring this distinction involves a simple internal habit, adding the phrase, "I am having the thought that," before a strong anxious belief rather than stating the belief directly as settled fact. "I'm going to fail at this" becomes "I am having the thought that I am going to fail at this." This small linguistic shift creates a small but genuine distance between the thinker and the thought, transforming an apparent fact into what it actually is, one interpretation among several possible ones, available for examination rather than automatic acceptance. This distinction does not require dismissing every difficult thought as automatically false. Some anxious thoughts do contain genuine, useful information worth examining seriously. The skill being described here is not blind positivity or automatic self-reassurance. It is accurate evaluation, treating a thought as a claim to be tested against actual evidence, rather than as an established fact that arrives already proven simply because it happened to occur with enough emotional intensity attached to it. There is a related practice worth naming, asking directly what evidence actually supports a specific anxious thought, and what evidence, if honestly considered, might point against it. This is not about forcing artificial positivity onto a genuine concern. It is about applying the same standard of evidence to an internal thought that would naturally be applied to any other claim encountered in daily life, rather than granting automatic, unquestioned authority simply because the claim happened to originate from inside one's own mind. There is a further layer worth adding here. Noticing that the same event often produces entirely different thoughts on different days, depending on mood, sleep, and general stress level, despite the actual external circumstances remaining completely unchanged. This variability itself is useful evidence, a clear demonstration that the thought is being generated by an internal state at least as much as by any objective feature of the situation being considered, which further supports treating the thought as one interpretation among several rather than as a fixed external fact. This distinction becomes particularly valuable during moments of physical exhaustion or emotional depletion, When the mind reliably produces more negative, more catastrophic interpretations of ordinary events than it would under more rested, regulated conditions. Recognizing this pattern, that a tired or depleted mind systematically generates harsher, less accurate thoughts, provides a genuinely useful piece of context that a particularly dark or alarming thought arriving late at night or after an exhausting day deserves considerably less immediate trust than the same thought might otherwise seem to warrant. A useful complementary practice involves deliberately delaying any significant decision or conclusion until basic physical needs, adequate sleep, sufficient food, a reasonable period of rest, have genuinely been met. Many thoughts that feel urgent and definitive late at night reveal themselves the following morning after proper rest to be considerably less alarming or significant than they initially appeared, which offers further practical evidence for treating a thought's intensity as separate from its actual accuracy. Chapter 4. Worry is not preparation. Worry frequently disguises itself as diligence, as taking a situation seriously, as responsible preparation for whatever might go wrong. This disguise is one of the most convincing and most costly in the entire landscape of anxious thinking because it makes worry feel virtuous, even necessary, rather than what it actually is in the vast majority of cases, repetitive, unproductive rumination that produces distress without producing any genuine plan. Genuine preparation has a specific, recognizable shape. It identifies a concrete risk, considers a small number of realistic responses, and then, crucially, stops, moving on to either taking action or setting the matter down until new information arrives. Worry lacks this shape entirely. It circles the same concern repeatedly, without ever producing a concrete next step, without ever actually finishing, because its underlying function was never genuinely to solve the problem. Its function was to produce a temporary, false sense of control over an uncertain future. A simple, practical test distinguishes the two. Has this specific round of thinking produced a concrete action or a genuine decision to let the matter rest until new information arrives? If the answer is no, and the same concern is simply being revisited for the 10th or 20th time without any new development, the activity underway is not preparation. It is worry, wearing preparation's clothing, and recognizing this distinction clearly is often enough on its own to interrupt the cycle considerably sooner than it would otherwise naturally end. There is also a specific cost worth naming honestly. That worry consumes exactly the mental resources genuine problem-solving actually requires. A mind exhausted by hours of anxious repetition has considerably less capacity remaining for the kind of clear, creative thinking an actual solution often demands. In this sense, worry does not simply fail to help. It actively depletes the very resource a real solution depends on. Consider two people facing the same uncertain situation, an upcoming medical test result, a pending decision from someone else entirely outside their control. One spends the waiting period in near constant rumination, replaying possible outcomes repeatedly. The other acknowledges the uncertainty honestly, identifies that no further useful action is currently available, and deliberately redirects attention toward the ordinary tasks of the day. Both people care equally about the outcome. Only one of them arrives at the actual result with any meaningful reserve of mental energy left over to handle whatever that result turns out to be. There is a useful practical marker for identifying the exact moment worry has stopped serving any purpose, noticing when the same 3 or 4 considerations begin repeating in slightly reordered form, without any new element being introduced. Genuine analysis tends to move forward, uncovering new angles or new information as it proceeds. Worry tends to move in circles, revisiting identical ground repeatedly. Recognizing this circular quality is often the clearest, most reliable signal available that a specific round of thinking has crossed over from useful consideration into unproductive repetition. There is a specific, gentle practice worth applying once this circularity has been noticed, explicitly telling oneself, silently or even aloud, that this specific matter has already received sufficient consideration and that continuing to revisit it will not produce additional useful insight. This may feel artificial or insufficient at first, Repeated consistently, it gradually trains the mind to accept a designated stopping point rather than assuming, as anxious thought habitually does, that one more round of analysis will finally be the one that produces genuine resolution. Chapter 5. The present moment as the only place anxiety cannot follow. Anxiety is, by its very nature, oriented toward time, either replaying a past that cannot be changed or projecting a future that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the form imagined. This single observation contains one of the more practically useful tools available to a mind seeking genuine quiet: the recognition that anxiety, almost without exception, cannot fully survive inside the actual present moment. Consider the specific content of anxious thought at any given instant. It nearly always involves either what already happened, a conversation, a decision, a mistake, or what has not yet happened, an outcome, a reaction, a future event. Genuinely examine the present instant itself. This exact breath, this exact sound in the room, this exact physical sensation of sitting or standing right now, and the anxious narrative, while it does not disappear entirely, tends to lose a significant portion of its grip because it was never actually describing this present instant in the first place. This is not a suggestion to permanently avoid planning or reflection, both of which are genuinely necessary and valuable activities. It is a specific tool for the moments anxiety has become excessive and repetitive, deliberately returning attention to a concrete present sensory detail, the weight of the body in a chair, the specific sound of breathing, the actual temperature of the air, as a way of interrupting a thought spiral that has drifted entirely into an imagined past or future. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, observed that the greatest weapon against stress is the ability to choose one thought over another. The present moment offers one of the most reliably available alternative thoughts that exists, precisely because it is always accessible, requires no special circumstances to reach, and stands in direct, immediate contrast to the imagined timelines anxiety depends on to sustain itself. This practice tends to feel deceptively simple when first described, and it is worth acknowledging honestly that it rarely eliminates anxious thought on the very first attempt. The mind, especially one accustomed to constant future projection, often resists this return to the present moment, drifting back toward the same worry within moments of the attempt. This resistance is not a sign of failure. It is simply evidence of how deeply the habitual pattern has been practiced, and like any habitual pattern, it responds to repeated, patient redirection far more reliably than to a single forceful attempt at correction. There is a related practice worth naming for moments when returning attention to a single present sensation feels genuinely difficult, deliberately naming several things currently perceivable through each of the senses. One sound, one physical sensation, one visible detail nearby. This slightly more structured version of the same underlying practice often succeeds in situations where a simpler, single point of focus proves too easy for a persistent, anxious mind to slip past unnoticed. It is worth adding a final clarification about this present moment practice, that it is not intended as a permanent avoidance of thinking about the past or future entirely, both of which remain necessary and valuable in their proper place. It is intended specifically as an interruption technique, a way of stepping outside an anxious loop that has already become repetitive and unproductive, creating enough space to then return to genuine reflection or planning deliberately, rather than being pulled back into it involuntarily by the same anxious momentum that the interruption was designed to break. There is one more useful variation worth mentioning, briefly noticing the simple fact of currently being safe, physically, in this exact moment, regardless of whatever uncertain future concern the mind happens to be circling. This is not a denial that genuine difficulties exist elsewhere in time. It is simply an accurate, verifiable observation about the present instant specifically, one that anxious thought, focused entirely on the past or an imagined future, frequently overlooks entirely while insisting that danger is close at hand. Chapter 6. Clearing mental clutter, one thing at a time. A significant portion of everyday anxiety comes not from any single overwhelming problem, but from the sheer accumulated volume of small, unfinished mental threads running simultaneously in the background. An unanswered message, an unmade decision, a vague sense that something important is being forgotten. Each individual thread might be entirely manageable on its own. Held simultaneously, dozens of them at once, they produce a persistent, low-grade static that makes genuine clarity considerably harder to reach. The mind, it turns out, treats an unfinished task very differently from a completed one, continuing to allocate a small amount of ongoing attention to anything left open, regardless of how minor that open item actually is. This explains why a single unanswered, unimportant email can occupy a surprising amount of background mental space, not because the email itself matters greatly, but because the mind has not yet been given a clear signal that the matter has been closed. A specific practical remedy exists for this accumulation, a brief, deliberate practice of writing down every currently open mental thread without attempting to solve any of them immediately, simply capturing them completely outside the mind, where they can be reviewed and prioritized later. This single act of externalizing an open list frequently produces an immediate, noticeable sense of relief, since the mind no longer needs to expend ongoing effort simply remembering what it is supposed to be tracking. Beyond this initial capture, genuine clarity is built through a specific discipline, deliberately attending to one thing at a time, rather than attempting to hold an entire list of concerns simultaneously in active awareness. This is not simply a productivity technique. It is a direct intervention against the specific kind of anxiety produced by mental overload, since a mind attending fully to one clear task at a time experiences considerably less of the diffuse background unease that comes from trying to hold everything open and unresolved at once. There is a specific reason this externalizing habit works so reliably, worth naming directly. The mind appears to maintain a kind of ongoing internal rehearsal for anything it perceives as unfinished or unresolved, a process some researchers have referred to as an open loop, continuing to consume background attention until a clear resolution or a clear plan has been recorded somewhere. The mind can trust it will not be forgotten. Writing a concern down, along with even a rough next step, frequently satisfies this internal requirement well enough to close the loop, freeing the attention it had been quietly consuming. There is a related, complementary habit worth naming, periodically reviewing this externalized list and deliberately removing items that, on reflection, no longer genuinely require action or attention. Lists built this way tend to grow over time if left unexamined, and a list that has become too long can begin producing its own low-level anxiety, defeating much of the original purpose. Treating the list itself as something to be actively maintained, rather than as a permanent, ever-expanding record, keeps this practice genuinely useful, rather than becoming simply another source of background unease. There is also a specific version of this practice worth applying at the close of each day, briefly reviewing whatever remains unresolved and consciously deciding for each item whether it genuinely requires attention tomorrow or whether it can simply be released as no longer significant. This end-of-day review tends to noticeably improve the quality of rest that follows, since the mind is considerably less likely to continue silently rehearsing an unresolved thread throughout the night if it has already been consciously acknowledged, sorted, and either scheduled or released during the waking hours beforehand. There is a related useful distinction worth drawing between genuinely open items and items that only feel open due to vague, unspecific worry. A task with a clear next action, however small, is genuinely open and benefits from this capturing practice. A vague, diffuse worry with no clear next action attached, such as general unease about the future, often benefits more from the present moment practice covered earlier in this audiobook than from being added to an ever-growing list, since it cannot actually be resolved through a specific scheduled action in the same way a concrete task can. Chapter 7. The Body Keeps Score. Physical Signals of an Overactive Mind. An anxious mind rarely operates in isolation from the body carrying it. Racing thoughts are consistently accompanied by physical signals, a tightened chest, a shallow breathing pattern, tension held in the shoulders or jaw, that both reflect and reinforce the mental pattern taking place. Learning to notice these physical signals early provides a genuinely useful, often underused entry point into interrupting an anxious spiral before it fully escalates. The relationship between body and mind here runs in both directions. Anxious thinking produces physical tension, and physical tension left unaddressed tends to feed back into further anxious thinking, creating a self-reinforcing loop that can continue for hours without either the mental or physical component ever being directly addressed. Noticing this loop as a genuine two-way system, rather than treating the mind and body as entirely separate concerns, opens up considerably more options for interrupting it. A simple, practical habit involves periodically checking in with the body throughout an ordinary day, noticing where tension has quietly accumulated, the shoulders, the jaw, the stomach, without judgment, simply as useful information about the current state of the nervous system. This kind of noticing frequently reveals that anxious thinking has been running in the background for some time, before it was ever consciously identified as a specific worry, since the body often registers the pattern well before the mind names it explicitly. This chapter does not prescribe a specific physical technique as a solution, since different bodies and different situations call for different responses. What matters most is simply the habit of noticing, recognizing physical tension as a signal worth paying attention to, rather than as unrelated background noise to be ignored entirely, while the mind continues spinning through its own separate, seemingly disconnected loop of anxious thought. There is a specific example worth naming here: the experience of realizing, partway through an ordinary task, that the jaw has been clenched or the shoulders raised for what turns out to have been an extended period of time, without any conscious awareness of when this tension actually began. This delayed noticing is common and reveals something important: that the body frequently registers an anxious state well before conscious thought, explicitly identifies a specific worry attached to it. Building the habit of noticing physical tension earlier provides an additional valuable entry point for catching an anxious pattern before it fully escalates into extended, conscious rumination. There is a further connection worth drawing here between physical tension and the specific quality of breathing that tends to accompany an anxious state, typically shallow, centered high in the chest rather than lower in the abdomen. Noticing this particular breathing pattern, without necessarily attempting to force it into a different shape immediately, often provides an early, reliable indicator that an anxious pattern has already begun, sometimes considerably before the actual anxious thoughts themselves become fully conscious and specific. There is a broader point worth making about this body and mind relationship: that addressing physical tension directly, through movement, stretching, or simply consciously relaxing a clenched muscle, frequently reduces the intensity of accompanying anxious thought, even without directly addressing the thought's specific content at all. This suggests that the physical and mental components of anxiety, while distinct, are close enough in practice that intervening at either point tends to produce some benefit for the entire system, which offers a genuinely practical option for moments when the anxious thoughts themselves feel too tangled or too numerous to address directly and clearly. There is a specific caution worth including here: that this connection between body and mind does not suggest anxiety is purely physical or can always be resolved through physical means alone. Some situations genuinely require addressing the underlying thought or circumstance directly, and physical intervention alone, while helpful, may only provide temporary relief if the actual source of concern remains completely unaddressed. The most reliable approach tends to combine both, attending to physical tension as an early signal, while also examining the specific thoughts driving it once that signal has been noticed clearly. There is a useful, broader point to close this chapter with: that overthinking, examined honestly, is rarely a sign of unusual intelligence or exceptional diligence, despite frequently feeling that way from the inside. It is simply a mind searching, quite understandably, for a certainty that a genuinely uncertain situation does not actually offer. Recognizing this reframes overthinking not as a virtue to be proud of, nor as a personal flaw to feel ashamed of, but simply as a common, well-understood pattern, one that responds reliably to the specific practices covered throughout this audiobook. Chapter 8. Overthinking as a search for control. Beneath most patterns of chronic overthinking lies a specific, understandable motive, a search for certainty in a situation that, by its nature, does not actually offer any. The mind keeps returning to the same unresolved question, believing, often without full awareness of this belief, that enough analysis will eventually produce a guaranteed, risk-free answer. In situations involving genuine uncertainty, other people's future behavior, unpredictable outcomes, unknown timelines, this guarantee simply does not exist, no matter how much additional thinking gets applied to searching for it. Recognizing overthinking as a search for an impossible certainty, rather than as a genuine step toward a real solution, changes the relationship to the pattern considerably. Instead of continuing to search for an answer that does not exist, attention can shift toward a different, more honest question. What is the most reasonable action available given the genuine uncertainty that remains, rather than what additional thinking might finally eliminate that uncertainty entirely? There is a specific discomfort worth naming honestly here, that tolerating genuine uncertainty, rather than continuing to search for an impossible guarantee, requires a kind of internal trust that many anxious minds have not yet had much practice building. This trust is not blind optimism. It is simply the recognition that most situations, even genuinely uncertain ones, tend to be navigable as they unfold, one step at a time, without requiring the entire outcome to be predicted and controlled in advance. Building this trust happens gradually, through repeated evidence rather than through a single decisive insight. Each time a genuinely uncertain situation is faced directly, without complete advanced certainty, and turns out to be manageable regardless, a small amount of evidence accumulates that uncertainty itself, while uncomfortable, is not actually as dangerous as an anxious mind consistently assumes it to be. Consider someone repeatedly analyzing whether a particular career decision will turn out well, replaying the same considerations for weeks, without reaching any new insight beyond what was already clear during the first genuine round of reflection. The additional analysis is rarely producing new understanding. It is producing the temporary, false comfort of feeling like something productive is happening, while the underlying uncertainty, which no amount of further thinking can actually resolve in advance, remains exactly as unresolved as it was at the very beginning of the process. There is a specific reframe worth adopting once this pattern becomes visible, replacing the question, "How can I be certain this will work out?" with a considerably more honest and answerable one, "What is a reasonable next step, given the uncertainty that genuinely remains?" The first question searches for something that does not exist and cannot be found through additional thought. The second question can actually be answered, often fairly quickly, and answering it tends to produce real forward movement rather than another round of circular, unproductive analysis. This reframe also carries a useful secondary benefit, restoring a sense of genuine agency in situations that otherwise feel entirely governed by uncontrollable uncertainty. While the ultimate outcome of a genuinely uncertain situation cannot be guaranteed in advance, the next reasonable step almost always can be identified and taking it, however small, tends to reduce anxious rumination considerably more effectively than continued analysis aimed at an impossible, guaranteed certainty ever could. Chapter 9. Not every worry needs to be shared. Close relationships offer a specific, complicated challenge for an anxious mind, the frequent instinct to seek constant reassurance by voicing every passing worry aloud to a partner, friend, or family member. This instinct is understandable. Sharing a burden genuinely can lighten it, and it can also, when practiced without discernment, quietly transfer an enormous, ongoing volume of unfiltered anxious thought onto people who were never actually equipped to resolve it, since the thoughts themselves were rarely about anything they had genuine influence over in the first place. A useful distinction exists between a concern genuinely worth discussing and a passing anxious thought, better simply observed and released internally. A concern worth discussing usually involves something the other person has actual context for, influence over, or a genuine stake in. A passing anxious thought, a brief worry about an unlikely, hypothetical scenario, a momentary spike of insecurity with no real new information behind it, often does not require voicing at all, and voicing it repeatedly can, over time, produce a specific relational cost, training both people to treat every fleeting worry as equally significant and equally deserving of shared attention. This is not a suggestion to withhold genuine feelings or important concerns from people who are trusted and invested in a life. It is a suggestion to apply the same distinction covered earlier in this audiobook between a thought and a fact before deciding whether a given worry genuinely needs an audience. Many anxious thoughts, examined honestly, resolve on their own within minutes, if simply allowed to pass without immediate voicing, revealing that they never actually required outside reassurance to begin with. There is also a specific benefit for the relationship itself in developing this discernment, protecting the shared emotional space for concerns that genuinely benefit from open discussion, rather than diluting that space with a constant, undifferentiated stream of passing worry that neither strengthens the relationship nor actually resolves the underlying anxious pattern producing it in the first place. There is a useful internal filter worth applying before voicing a passing worry aloud, waiting a brief period, perhaps an hour, perhaps until the following morning, before deciding whether the concern still feels significant enough to genuinely warrant discussion. A remarkable number of anxious thoughts lose much of their apparent urgency once this small amount of time has passed, revealing that the original impulse to share was driven more by the intensity of the momentary feeling than by any lasting, genuine significance in the underlying concern itself. There is a further nuance worth naming here about the difference between reassurance seeking and genuine emotional support. Repeatedly asking a partner whether everything is really fine, having already received that answer once, often reflects a search for a feeling of certainty that no amount of repeated reassurance can actually provide permanently, since the underlying anxious pattern generating the question was never really about the specific answer in the first place. Genuine emotional support, by contrast, tends to involve sharing a feeling honestly once, and then allowing the other person's response to actually be received and trusted, rather than immediately generating a fresh round of doubt that prompts the same question to be asked again shortly afterward. There is a broader relational benefit worth naming as this discernment develops over time, that partners and close friends often report feeling more genuinely trusted and respected once the constant stream of minor, unfiltered worry begins to reduce, since a relationship no longer defined primarily by managing anxious reassurance has considerably more room available for the kind of connection, humor, and shared experience that anxious oversharing had previously been crowding out. There is a specific benefit worth naming for the person carrying the worry as well, entirely separate from any effect on the relationship. Practicing this brief pause before sharing builds exactly the same distinction covered earlier in this audiobook between a thought and a fact, since a worry that fails to survive even a short waiting period reveals itself quite clearly as one of the passing, exaggerated thoughts anxiety regularly manufactures, rather than as a genuinely significant concern deserving of extended outside attention. Chapter 10. Deciding without endless deliberation. Professional environments regularly demand decisions under incomplete information, and an anxious mind, seeking the same impossible certainty described earlier in this audiobook, often responds by deliberating far longer than the actual stakes of the decision genuinely warrant. A minor decision, which email template to use, which of two similar vendors to select, can consume disproportionate mental energy, precisely because the anxious mind treats every open decision as equally significant and equally worthy of exhaustive analysis. A useful practical framework distinguishes decisions by their actual reversibility and actual stakes. A decision that is easily reversible and relatively low stakes deserves a quick, reasonably informed choice, followed by genuine movement forward, rather than extended deliberation searching for a guaranteed, optimal answer that, in most low-stakes cases, does not meaningfully exist. A decision that is genuinely difficult to reverse and genuinely high stakes deserves more careful, thorough consideration, though even here, a defined limit on deliberation time tends to produce better outcomes than open-ended, anxious analysis that continues indefinitely without ever reaching a clear conclusion. René Descartes wrote that it is not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to use it well. Applied to professional decision-making specifically, a mind capable of careful analysis is only genuinely useful when that analysis is deliberately bounded rather than allowed to run indefinitely under the mistaken belief that more time invariably produces a better answer. In practice, decisions deliberated well past the point of diminishing returns rarely improve in quality. They simply consume additional time and energy while producing very little additional insight beyond what had already been considered in the first substantial pass. Building this discipline requires practicing decisiveness deliberately on smaller, lower-stakes decisions first, setting a genuine time limit, making the choice, and moving forward without revisiting it. This practice, repeated consistently, gradually builds both the actual skill and the internal trust required to apply the same bounded, decisive approach to larger, more significant decisions when they eventually arrive. There is a specific workplace pattern worth naming: the tendency to seek additional opinions or additional data indefinitely, under the belief that just one more piece of information will finally eliminate all remaining uncertainty from a decision. In practice, most decisions reach a point of diminishing returns fairly quickly, where additional information no longer meaningfully changes the likely outcome, yet continues to be gathered simply because the anxious mind has not yet given itself permission to decide with the information already available. A useful habit for building comfort with this bounded approach involves explicitly setting a deadline before beginning any significant deliberation, deciding in advance exactly when a decision will be made, regardless of how complete the available information feels at that point. This small structural commitment shifts the underlying question from "when will I finally feel certain enough," which may never arrive, to what is the best decision achievable by this specific predetermined point, which is a question genuinely capable of being answered. There is a related benefit worth naming for team environments specifically, where a leader's visible comfort with bounded, timely decision-making tends to set a broader cultural tone, encouraging others to bring reasonably considered options forward rather than endlessly perfecting a proposal out of fear it might not survive scrutiny. A culture that rewards clear, bounded decisiveness over exhaustive, open-ended deliberation tends to move faster overall and tends to produce less collective anxiety than one where every decision seems to require unlimited analysis before it can be considered acceptable to finally act upon. There is a final point worth making about the relationship between speed and quality in decision-making specifically, that beyond a certain point, additional deliberation time actually correlates with worse outcomes rather than better ones, as second-guessing and anxious reconsideration begin to erode the confidence and clarity of an already sound initial judgment. Recognizing that more time is not automatically synonymous with a better decision helps loosen the grip of the belief that endless deliberation is somehow the more careful, more responsible approach, when in many ordinary situations it is simply anxious avoidance of the discomfort involved in committing to a choice. Chapter 11. Building a daily practice of mental stillness. A quiet mind is not achieved through a single insight, however clarifying that insight might feel in the moment it arrives. It is built the way any genuine capacity is built, through consistent, repeated practice across ordinary days, most of which will not feel particularly dramatic or noteworthy while they are actually happening. A simple, sustainable daily practice involves setting aside a brief period, even a few minutes, specifically to notice the mind's activity without immediately engaging every thought that arises. This is not about achieving a permanently blank, thought-free state, which is neither realistic nor actually the goal. It is about practicing the specific skill of observing a thought pass through awareness without automatically following it into extended analysis, worry, or emotional reaction. There is a Buddhist teaching, often summarized simply as, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." Applied here, this points toward a specific practical truth, that the habitual patterns of thought practiced daily, whether anxious rumination or calm, deliberate observation, gradually shape the mind's default operating state over time. A mind that practices, even briefly, observing thoughts without automatically chasing every one of them, gradually becomes a mind that requires considerably less effort to maintain that same calm, observant stance during an ordinary, Busy day. This daily practice does not need to be elaborate or lengthy to be genuinely effective. A brief period of quiet attention, repeated consistently across weeks and months, tends to produce far more durable results than an occasional, lengthy session practiced inconsistently. The cumulative effect of this consistency, more than the specific technique used within any single session, is ultimately what gradually reshapes an anxious, racing mind into one capable of genuine, reliable stillness. There is a specific obstacle worth naming honestly: the common belief that this kind of daily practice requires perfect execution to be worthwhile. A completely still mind achieved every single session. In reality, the actual practice consists largely of noticing the mind wandering back into anxious thought and gently redirecting attention once again, repeated many times within even a single short session. This repeated redirection, not any extended period of perfect stillness, is where the genuine training actually takes place. The same way physical strength is built through repeated repetitions, rather than through holding a single perfect position indefinitely without ever needing correction. There is also value in choosing a consistent time of day for this practice, since consistency of timing tends to build the habit considerably faster than attempting the practice sporadically whenever it happens to be remembered. A brief period each morning, before the day's demands have fully taken hold, or each evening as a way of settling the mind before rest, both work well. What matters most is simply the regularity, allowing the practice to become an expected, familiar part of the day rather than an occasional, easily forgotten afterthought. There is a final encouraging observation worth adding here, that the benefits of this daily practice tend to extend well beyond the specific minutes set aside for it. A mind that has practiced noticing and releasing thoughts, even briefly each day, gradually becomes somewhat quicker at applying that same noticing throughout the rest of an ordinary day as well, catching an anxious spiral slightly earlier during a stressful meeting or a difficult conversation, simply because the underlying skill has been strengthened through consistent, if brief, daily repetition. There is a specific way to sustain motivation for this practice during periods when progress feels slow or inconsistent, keeping a brief, informal record of specific moments where the practice noticeably helped, a decision made more calmly than usual, a worry released more quickly than it once would have been. Reviewing this record periodically provides concrete, personal evidence of gradual progress, which tends to be considerably more motivating than relying on a vague, general sense of whether the practice is working, especially during the ordinary stretches when day-to-day change feels too gradual to notice on its own. There is a specific reason this daily practice compounds so reliably over months, rather than fading the way many self-improvement efforts eventually do, that its value is felt almost immediately, even in small doses, rather than requiring a long delay before any benefit becomes noticeable. A single session of deliberately observing thoughts without chasing them often produces a small, immediate sense of relief, which naturally reinforces the habit far more effectively than a practice whose benefits only become apparent after months of consistent effort with no interim reward along the way. Chapter 12. The freedom of an uncluttered mind. Everything covered throughout this audiobook points toward a single integrated shift, learning to relate to thought itself differently, no longer treating every thought as an automatic fact demanding immediate attention, but as one piece of passing mental activity among many, some worth following and many others worth simply observing and releasing without further engagement. A genuinely quiet mind does not mean a mind that has stopped thinking, planning or caring about the people and outcomes that genuinely matter in a life. It means a mind that has learned to distinguish between thoughts that deserve real attention and thoughts that are simply loud, between genuine preparation and worry wearing preparation's disguise, between a present moment fully inhabited and an imagined past or future anxiety, keeps insisting on revisiting instead. This shift changes the felt experience of an ordinary day in ways that are easy to underestimate before they actually occur. Decisions stop requiring endless deliberation. Relationships stop absorbing an undifferentiated stream of passing worry. The body stops carrying the constant, low-grade tension of a mind that never learned how to rest. And underneath all of it, a specific, quiet confidence begins to grow. Not the confidence of having eliminated every source of genuine difficulty from life, but the confidence of trusting one's own mind to meet whatever arrives with clarity, rather than with the exhausting, repetitive noise that anxiety had for so long mistaken for genuine thought. There is a final observation worth making about how this shift tends to reveal itself in daily life, often not through any single dramatic moment of realization, but through a gradual, cumulative noticing. A difficult situation handled with unexpected calm, a decision made without the usual extended deliberation, a passing worry that simply dissolved within minutes instead of consuming an entire evening the way it once reliably would have. These small, easy-to-overlook moments, accumulated across enough ordinary days, are where the quiet mind this audiobook describes actually takes root, far more reliably than through any single isolated insight, however clarifying that insight initially felt. There is a further point worth making about how this shift tends to affect relationships with other people, not just internal experience. A mind less consumed by constant anxious repetition has considerably more genuine attention available for the people actually present in any given moment, rather than half listening while a portion of attention remains occupied replaying an unrelated worry from earlier in the day. This spillover benefit, improved presence and attention toward others, is rarely the primary motivation for pursuing a quieter mind, and it tends to become one of the more noticeable and appreciated results once the underlying practice has genuinely taken hold. There is one further practical observation worth ending this chapter with. This shift toward a quieter mind tends to be noticed by others considerably before it is fully trusted by the person experiencing it internally. A friend or colleague may comment on seeming calmer or more present well before the underlying anxious patterns feel fully resolved from the inside. This gap is worth expecting rather than being discouraged by, since internal change of this kind typically outpaces internal certainty about that change, and trusting the external evidence even before it feels fully believed internally tends to accelerate the remaining portion of the process considerably. Conclusion. Total clarity is a direction, not a destination. The quiet mind described throughout this audiobook was never meant to describe a permanent, finished state, reached once and maintained effortlessly forever afterward. It describes a direction, a consistent ongoing practice of noticing which thoughts deserve genuine attention and which ones are simply noise, repeated across enough ordinary days that it gradually becomes the mind's default way of operating. Rather than an effortful technique deployed only during moments of obvious crisis, every chapter here returned in different forms to the same underlying idea. A thought is not automatically a fact, however convincing it feels in the moment it arrives. Worry frequently disguises itself as preparation while actually preventing it. The present moment offers a genuine shelter. Anxiety cannot fully enter, always available, requiring no special circumstances to reach. And a truly quiet mind is not one that has stopped thinking. It is one that has learned through consistent practice which of its own thoughts are actually worth following. This knowledge does not remove genuine problems, genuine uncertainty, or genuine emotional difficulty from a life. Nothing realistically could, and nothing genuinely worth pursuing would attempt to. What it offers instead is a mind considerably better equipped to meet those genuine difficulties clearly, rather than one already exhausted by hundreds of imagined difficulties that anxious, unexamined thought had manufactured entirely on its own, without ever actually being asked to. There is a real sustainable freedom available in this shift, not the freedom of a mind that has stopped functioning or stopped caring, but the freedom of a mind that has finally learned to trust itself, to meet an uncertain future without needing to control every detail of it in advance, and to let a passing thought simply pass rather than following it into hours of unnecessary noise. That freedom, more than any single technique described anywhere in this audiobook, is where total clarity has always quietly waited, available the entire time for the racing mind to finally learn how to rest. Think back to where this audiobook began, lying awake at 3 a.m, body still, mind sprinting in circles through conversations already over and problems that had not yet occurred and might never occur at all. That experience was never proof of a mind too broken or too weak to find rest. It was proof only that the mind had never been shown the difference between a thought that deserved to be followed and a thought that deserved simply to pass. What this audiobook offered was not a way to stop thinking entirely, which is neither possible nor genuinely desirable. It offered a way to think more selectively, trusting the mind to sort its own contents, rather than treating every single thought as equally urgent, equally true, and equally deserving of hours spent circling it. This shift, practiced patiently across enough ordinary days, eventually changes something considerably larger than any single anxious night ever could. It changes the underlying relationship between a person and their own mind, from one of constant vigilance against an endless stream of urgent-seeming thoughts toward one of quiet, earned trust, the trust that a racing thought can be noticed, considered briefly, and released, without needing to be followed all the way into exhaustion before it is finally allowed to pass. There is a genuinely encouraging way to close this audiobook, with a simple reminder that this entire practice belongs to ordinary life, rather than to any special, separate category of self-improvement. It shows up in a delayed reply to a friend that no longer spirals into hours of assumed rejection. It shows up in a difficult decision made cleanly, without weeks of second-guessing that follow it afterward. It shows up quietly and gradually, in simply more evenings spent present with the people actually in the room, rather than half-absent, still circling a thought from earlier that never actually needed to be carried this far. There is a final honest acknowledgement worth making before this audiobook closes. Some nights will still bring a racing mind, some days will still bring a spiral of worry that takes longer than it should to notice and release. This does not mean any of what has been covered here has failed. It simply means the old pattern was practiced far longer than the new one has had time to settle in, and that noticing this pull without harsh self-judgment, choosing the pause anyway, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, is exactly how a quiet mind is actually built over time, one ordinary thought at a time, rather than through a single permanent decision made once and never needing to be revisited again. This has been Coffee and Audiobooks. Until the next chapter, keep your coffee close, keep your mind clear, and let the thoughts that do not serve you simply pass on by.